February 1945, the Luxembourg-Germany border, a freezing mist clings to the surface of the Our River. The water is a dark, churning muscle of gray, moving with a speed that hides its true depth. On the western bank, a line of American soldiers stands in the mud. They are shivering. They are waiting for the order to step into the current. A battalion commander stands over a map spread across the hood of a mud-splattered jeep. He holds a ruler. He measures the distance from bank to bank and taps a specific point on the paper. It is the narrowest part of the river. It looks efficient. It looks like the shortest path to victory. But the water here moves at 6 knots, and the bottom is jagged rock. This is the story of a commander who trusted a map more than the men who walked the ground. It is the story of a decision that led to 9 empty sets of boots and a general who decided that arrogance deserved its own brand of justice. This is the story of a commander whose pride blinded him to the warnings of his own men and the lethal reality of a river in winter. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the cost of pride in a war that punished it. By joining us, you help keep these records of justice and consequence alive for the generations to come. Captain Frederick Olson was 29 years old. He came from Portland, Oregon. He served as the commander of a combat engineer company attached to the infantry. Before the war, Olson had worked on bridge crews in the Pacific Northwest, handling timber and steel in the rain-slicked forests of the Cascades. He knew how water behaved when it was confined by narrow banks. He understood the hidden violence of a fast-moving current. In 3 years of service, he had earned a reputation for being meticulous because he had seen what happened to men when a structure failed. He had walked the banks of the Our River twice in the dark of night, risking sniper fire to drop a weighted line and check the depth. He had seen the way the water boiled over the rocks at the narrow point and knew it was a death trap. He had documented every foot of the bank, and his recommendation was clear. Move 800 meters downstream, where the river was wide. The current was sluggish, and the bottom was soft sand. He was a man who trusted his eyes and his boots. Major Robert Grimes was 36 years old. He came from Houston, Texas. He was the battalion commander, and he viewed the war as a series of geometric problems to be solved with a straight edge. Grimes was a man of significant polish. His boots were always shown to a mirror finish, and his uniform was tailored to a sharp, aggressive fit that seemed out of place in the mud of Luxembourg. He had spent the years before the war in administrative roles and had survived the Command and General Staff College by memorizing textbooks. To Grimes, the map was the reality. He believed that the shortest distance between 2 points was the only logical choice, and any deviation was a sign of hesitation or weakness. He dismissed the physical realities of the terrain as excuses made by lesser men. When he looked at the Our River, he did not see a lethal force of nature. He saw a 30-meter gap on a piece of paper. He believed his rank gave him a superior perspective that rendered the technical expertise of an engineer irrelevant. He told his staff that geometry was the only law he recognized, and he intended to prove it. By February 1945, the Third Army had punched through the Siegfried Line. But the German frontier was not yet conquered. The landscape was a jagged maze of frozen ridges and swollen rivers that acted as natural moats for the retreating Wehrmacht. The weather was a constant enemy. Freezing rain turned the soil into a thick, sucking paste that swallowed tank treads and slowed the infantry to a crawl. In this environment, every river crossing was a high-stakes gamble. The German defenders knew the terrain intimately and had zeroed their artillery on every likely bridgehead. For the American advance to maintain its momentum, speed was essential. But it had to be tempered by a brutal respect for the physical world. The chaos of the late war advance often created a dangerous vacuum of oversight. Battalions were operating on high-tempo schedules, pushed by a command structure that demanded rapid gains. This pressure frequently led to a friction between the technical experts on the ground and the tactical officers in the command tents. Engineers like Olson were trained to see the river as a hydraulic force, while officers like Grimes were trained to see it as a line on a topographical map. In many units, the word of a battalion commander was absolute law, rarely questioned by subordinates, who feared being labeled as hesitant or defeatist. Other senior officers had frequently overlooked these types of administrative bullying, viewing the loss of a few men or pieces of equipment as the inevitable friction of war. They accepted the map burners and the textbook warriors because they kept the columns moving forward on paper. This specific stretch of the Our River was particularly treacherous. The melting snows in the Eifel Mountains had turned small streams into torrents, and the narrow gorges acted as funnels that increased the water's kinetic energy to a lethal degree. While the wider bends offered safety through surface area, the narrow points offered only speed and violence. Major Grimes stood on the ridge overlooking the narrowest gap, his eyes fixed on the far bank. He was not looking at the white water or the jagged rocks breaking the surface. He was looking at his watch and his map, calculating the seconds he thought he could save by ignoring the advice of the men who had actually touched the water. The stage was set for a disaster that would be measured in drowned men and shattered timber. Captain Olson stood by the idling jeep and pointed toward the churning water of the narrow gorge. "Major Grimes," he said, "I've measured that current at 6 knots. It's too fast for the assault boats. The bottom is solid rock, which means we can't anchor a bridge. We need to move the crossing point." Major Grimes did not look up from the map he had pinned to the hood of his vehicle. He kept his finger on the narrowest point. "That gap is 30 meters wide, Captain," Grimes replied. "The site you're suggesting is twice that. I'm not doubling the exposure time for my men just because the water looks a little rough." "It isn't about looks, Major," Olson said. He stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "My men walked that bank. If we put boats in there, they'll be swept onto the rocks before they hit the midpoint. The wider crossing downstream has a sandy bottom, and the current is less than half this speed. It's the safer route." Grimes finally looked up, his face reddening. He adjusted the cuff of his clean uniform. "Captain, I studied river crossings at the Command and General Staff College. I know the principles of tactical geometry. Shortest distance equals fastest crossing. It's basic math." Olson shook his head. "Geometry doesn't account for the physics of 6 knots of water, sir. If we lose the boats, we lose the momentum. And we lose the men." Grimes stepped into the captain's space. His voice was cold and sharp. "Are you refusing a direct order because you're afraid of a little spray, Olson? This battalion is moving at 0400. We are crossing at the narrow point because I said so. Now, get your engineers ready to lay that bridge, or I'll find a company commander who isn't looking for excuses to stall." Olson stood his ground for a second, looking at the man who had never seen a river through anything but a lens of ink and paper. "Very well, sir," Olson said, "but I want it noted that the technical assessment was rejected." Grimes laughed. "Note whatever you like, Captain. Just be ready to move." At 0400, the first assault boat hit the water. It didn't even make it 10 meters. The current caught the bow and flipped the heavy craft like it was made of paper. Men screamed as they were pulled into the dark. The second and third boats followed, spinning out of control and shattering against the rocks. 9 soldiers vanished into the freezing blackness. The crossing was halted. The mission was a disaster. The report of the drowning and the ignored warnings reached Patton's headquarters within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. The roar of a high-compression engine cut through the sound of the rushing water as a lone jeep splashed through the deep mud of the staging area. The vehicle skidded to a halt near the battalion command post. Patton stepped out before the wheels had stopped turning. He wore his full service uniform, perfectly pressed despite the rain, with 4 silver stars gleaming on his helmet and his signature ivory-handled revolvers holstered at his hips. He didn't say a word as he walked toward the bank. He stood at the edge of the narrow crossing for a long minute, watching the gray water tear past the rocks and swirl into violent eddies. The silence he brought with him was heavier than the sound of the river. Patton turned his gaze toward Major Grimes, who was standing stiffly at attention. The general's voice was low, almost a whisper. Yet it seemed to cut through the wind. "Major, did you stand on this bank before you ordered the first boat into the water?" Grimes cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on a point over Patton's shoulder. "No, sir. I analyzed the topographical data and determined the most efficient route." Patton's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did your engineer, Captain Olson, provide you with a physical survey of this current and the riverbed?" Grimes hesitated. "He did, sir, but I found his assessment to be overly cautious given our operational timeline." Patton took a step closer, his face inches from the major's. "So you decided that a ruler and a map were more reliable than the eyes of a man who actually touched the water?" Grimes swallowed hard. "Sir, The shortest distance between 2 points is a geometric certainty. Water does not give a damn about your geometry, Major. It cares about physics. You sat in a warm tent and looked at a line on a piece of paper, and you convinced yourself that you were a master of the elements. You believed your rank gave you the right to ignore the laws of nature. You treated those 9 men like pencil marks to be erased because you were too arrogant to listen to the expert standing right next to you. Captain Olson didn't give you a suggestion. He gave you a warning. He told you the water was too fast. He told you the bottom was rock. He told you that his boats would capsize. An officer who thinks he knows more than the man on the ground is a danger to every soldier under his command. You prioritized your own pride over the lives of your men. You wanted to be the hero who made the fastest crossing in the sector, and instead, you are the man who sent 9 Americans to the bottom of a river for no reason at all. There is a wide crossing 800 meters from here that is calm, sandy, and safe. You ignored it because it didn't fit your tidy little map. Now, you have a choice. You can admit right now that your incompetence killed those men and accept your relief, or you can stay here and watch as I promote the man you ignored. Either way, you are finished in this battalion. Stapper aside. The relief of Major Grimes was executed with a cold, surgical efficiency that left the remaining officers of the battalion in stunned silence. Patton did not send Grimes to a rear echelon desk or a comfortable administrative post. Instead, he ordered the major to stand on the muddy bank of the wider, safer crossing point downstream, and personally hand each soldier into the assault boats. For 4 hours, Grimes stood knee-deep in the freezing slush of the Our River. He watched as Captain Olson's engineers easily anchored the pontoon bridges into the soft, sandy bottom he had claimed was a waste of time. He smelled the diesel exhaust of the idling trucks and the wet wool of the infantrymen who brushed past him, their eyes averted from the man who had almost sent them to their deaths. Every splash of the oars and every rhythmic thud of the hammers was a public indictment of his failure. The soldiers of the battalion saw their former commander reduced to a traffic guard, stripped of his authority and his dignity in the very water he had refused to respect. By the time the last boat departed and the sun began to set over the German border, the legend of the shortest distance had been buried in the sand, replaced by a new, hard-won respect for the men who walked the ground. Captain Frederick Olson returned to Portland after the war. He never worked on a river project again. He spent 40 years as a structural engineer for the state, designing mountain passes and bridges that could withstand any pressure. He lived into his 90s, passing away in 2008 surrounded by grandchildren who knew him only as a quiet, meticulous man who hated to see a job rushed. He kept a small piece of jagged river stone on his desk for the rest of his life. It was a weight to keep his papers down and a reminder of the 9 men he couldn't save from a map. Major Robert Grimes was never given another combat command. He was transferred to a desk in the Quartermaster Corps in Paris and quietly discharged in 1946. He returned to Houston and entered the real estate market, building a successful firm based on strict adherence to efficiency and cost-cutting. He never spoke about the Our River. He never apologized to the families of the men who drowned. He died in 1982, leaving behind a legacy of business success and a military record that ended with a single, devastating performance review from the 3rd Army commander. General Patton mentioned the incident only once in his private diary toward the end of February. He wrote that the greatest sin a commander can commit is the sin of distance. He noted that the earth has no interest in a man's rank and that the river is the ultimate judge of an officer's worth. He believed that the 9 men lost that morning were not victims of the German army, but victims of a man who thought he was smarter than the ground he walked on. He never forgot the sight of those empty boats spinning in the current. Some historians argue that Patton's public humiliation of a battalion commander was a reckless display of ego that undermined the military chain of command during a critical offensive. They suggest that such a visible reprimand could have paralyzed other officers, making them too fearful of failure to take necessary tactical risks in the heat of battle. Others argue that the general's intervention was a vital act of leadership that saved hundreds of lives by re-establishing the primacy of technical expertise over unearned rank. They contend that in the brutal environment of the German frontier, the only real authority was the truth of the terrain. What is certain is that after the disaster on the Our River, the Third Army adopted a permanent change in its operational doctrine, ensuring that no crossing was ever attempted without the signed approval of a combat engineer who had stood on the bank. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply filed a reprimand through the usual channels? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the cost of pride in a war that punished it, make sure you subscribe.